Today we're going to be talking about what is trauma. We're talking about what is emotionally frozen in time. What does that phrase mean? We'll be talking about what makes our emotional age come out or come to the surface. And lastly, how do we work towards a resolution? Because that's what everybody really wants to get to. But as we know, and as Benny will tell you, it takes time. Time takes time. All right, everybody, welcome back to Start the Conversation. On our episode today, we have Gerald Lane. He is the COO at Resolutions Healthcare. Benny Strumolo, he's the CEO and Chief Clinical Officer at Resolutions Healthcare. And I am Dalton Blase. I'm the Director of Experiential and the Minister on the grounds for Resolutions Healthcare. You can check us out at resolutionshealthcare.com. See our inpatient facility, Hidden Oaks. Also have outpatient offices in Gun Barrel and Kaufman, so you can check those out as well. Today we're going to be talking about what is trauma. We're talking about what is emotionally frozen in time. What does that phrase mean? We'll be talking about what makes our emotional age come out or come to the surface. And lastly, how do we work towards a resolution? Because that's what everybody really wants to get to. But as we know, and as Benny will tell you, it takes time. Time takes time. So, Benny, I'm going to kick it over to you. What is trauma?
Thanks, Dalton. Okay. In previous video of Start the Conversation, we discussed what is a traumatic event. Today, it's a little different, generalizing it to what is trauma. I defined it in my resolution focused therapy, and I'll read it out because my definition is a little different than you may see in other places. And I define a trauma as the individual is affected by a life event in a manner that causes him to excessively reflect on or obsess with negative, fabricated, or a distorted idea about how that event may have or should have been prevented if that individual had responded differently. To suffer from continuous reenactments and or flashbacks of that event, causing a profound effect on that individual ability to function in a present time frame, or look to and plan any future goals or activities, and interfering with daily life and social activities. I ended with the severity of the trauma and the individual's mental health at the time of the trauma will affect the impact of that event. Now, just to add to that,
Well, shorten that
go
up
ahead.
for the people with the goldfish memory. How would you put that in one sentence? What is trauma for the people in the Bay?
An intensely distressing or overwhelming experience. Now,
It could be anything to anybody. It's going to be different.
right, and I read, and some things kind of, okay, an actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence, witnessing violence, repeated exposure to stressful events. And in the previous video, I get into death and dying, medical illness, accidents. Now, those are traumatic events. The trauma itself now is the event happening. And what says it's a trauma versus an everyday kind of thing that happens?
Right.
We go through our day, you move along through the day, and sometimes you, nothing stops you. Other times, something will happen and it stops you dead in your tracks.
Right.
That's almost the same kind of thing. You have to look at something out of the ordinary that happens. Now, whether how that impacts you is going to depend on who you are, where you came from, what your life experience have been. And then the event happens, resolution occurs right there and then. Others, event happens, too overwhelming, emotions break off, and now you're off and running into post-traumatic stress disorder kind of symptoms.
So basically, if you live life long enough, you've had some kind of traumatic event.
And that's what we talk about at the inpatient treatment center and what I talk about in my trauma and addictions group. Yes. From what I just, the list I just gave you, there's no one that's going to avoid a traumatic event
Right.
unless you know how to avoid death and dying of a loved one in your life.
Yeah.
Accidents, well, that's why they call them accidents. Medical illnesses. So I think the thing I stress the most is whether it truly is a traumatic, unresolved traumatic event for you or not. And that'll depend on what your experiences have been. Where I come from, violence and growing up and seeing and witnessing fights or violent events was kind of possible in my area.
Right.
So as an adult, if I see things like that, it's not going to have the same impact on me as it would be someone who grew up without any of that in suburbia, no kind of violent
Right.
events, and then suddenly they're an adult and they run smack into some form of violence on the streets. That can have a big impact on them.
Right.
So
Makes
again,
people totally different.
and then now you add to that your state of mind at the time of an event. The more work you have done on yourself, the stronger you are as an individual, the more capable you are of handling events in your life.
And really, how grounded or how capable can you be when you're, say we face a traumatic event when we're 9, 10, 11 years old. Well, we ain't got a lot to work with at that point.
Exactly. And now when you get into children and adolescents who I worked with for 15 years, severe cases,
Now it's more the environment and
it has a big difference.
Yeah.
Right. It's a big difference than experiencing childhood trauma versus adult trauma. So
There's a phrase that you coined in resolution focused therapy, emotionally frozen in time. Can you explain that a little bit and give us some insight into what is emotionally frozen in time?
yeah, I coined that somewhere back in the late 90s when I was working with severely emotionally disturbed children in a locked facility. After years and many cases, I started realizing that a traumatic event for someone kind of stopped them dead in their tracks, froze them emotionally. Now, what does that mean? Well, for a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old going through being abused, say, and being frozen in time. Now, fast forward, and we get them in our addiction treatment center, and I get a 21-year-old who we notice when they get stressed out and they start acting more like a child. It's very obvious when you get frozen in time as a child or adolescent versus an adult. But all I'm saying is, if you think about an event happens to you, it stops you. It stops time. For an adult to relate, when I train therapists, I train them to think of if you go for a medical test, most people have gone for a medical test. Okay, you're not sure. You may think you have something. So you go for your test, you get the test taken. What do you do for the next day? What's on your mind?
Spinning.
What's that test?
Yeah.
What's going through your mind? Right.
What's wrong with me?
Right. Am I okay? Am I going to have something wrong? During that time period, have you progressed at all in your anything in life? Or are you kind of spinning on that test result? How important is it?
Yeah.
How important is it to go to lunch with your friends or to go to dinner that night, or to go meet up with people when now you're waiting for your test results?
Right.
So you're kind of stopped in time. Okay. And then the next day you get the call and everything's okay. You unstuck, you go about now your business takes off. Or no, you get the call and it's serious. You have a problem.
Bad news.
stops you. Again, you'll hear people say they kind of just froze. That and all they can focus on now is what's wrong with them. So take that and imagine a 5, 6, 7 year old, a 12-year old, 15-year old, and suddenly an event happens that's traumatic. They get stuck and it doesn't get resolved. Picture that spinning now. Let's say I think the record at our facility with the trauma and addictions group is someone spinning for about 40 something years, I think it was.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
they're kind of frozen. They're frozen in time. So that's what, and it's very obvious when you work with children. So that's where I noticed it. Now, of course, how do you get are you doomed for the rest of your life to be frozen in time? Well, no. Same way I coined that phrase where with kids I was working with, when we work towards trauma resolution, what I noticed, I'm working with a 6-year-old frozen back at 6 months old. The minute we reach a point, maybe a year in therapy it was, I noticed them getting unstuck. I call it getting stuck or getting unfrozen in time. And emotionally, over the next 2 months, they aged 5 years.
Right.
So their emotional age caught up once you get them unfrozen from that event. It's a little harder in adults to notice that because something happens at 21. Well, and I meet you at 40. Okay, it's not going to be so obvious that you're frozen, but I will know by your growth, your awareness. You'll notice people go 10, 20, 30, 40 years and they still kind of not growing. There's nothing happening other than
Right.
just existing. So
Okay.
that's the brief answer.
That's the brief answer. All right.
That's the whole house showing itself.
I would hate to hear the longer. Okay. How about this? How does or what makes our emotional age come to the surface? You hit on it a little bit if a traumatic event pops up again, but dive into that a little more.
Yeah. Now this goes back to our days when we were all together and we started the facility in Scurry. And when I did the training and trained therapists, I would train them what to look for. Okay. So now think about it. Think about when our clients or people go to the medication line and they want their medication. And the nurse says no to somebody. No, you can't have that.
Yeah.
If I'm there and I'm watching, I'll be able to tell if you are stuck or emotionally frozen somewhere.
How you react to that?
Exactly, how you react. We've seen it. We've all witnessed it. If you start throwing a temper tantrum,
Ooh.
what does it remind you of? Well, 4 or 5 year old,
Yeah.
almost like flopping around on the floor without flopping around, but in your head, you're acting like a 4 or 5 year old. That's to me, it's almost a crystal ball into their life. And I will zero in on that timeline to know something happened at about that point. What happens if they start bravado, bully, loud, arguing, fighting? They start an argument with the staff, with you all, with the nurses. Acts more like teenager,
Yeah.
14, 15-year-old.
Right.
So that's where, so it comes to surface when they're emotionally charged or a stressful situation. So now take that knowledge and apply it for people listening. You apply it to your relationships at home now.
Me and you talked about that in my life the other day.
Yes.
Wow.
Exactly. That once you're stressed, you're going to go to where you're kind of stuck on that issue, maybe not on that issue, but under stress, that emotional age will emerge. And when it's over, you regain, recapture, and you kind of move on. But that kind of give you an idea of where a therapist would need to look to start working, or it did for me anyway.
Good insight. All right, and then the question everybody's been waiting for. There's definitely no crystal ball for this one. How do we find resolution?
Yeah, well, and there's no short answer
There's
for
no
that.
short answer.
There's no way I'm going to answer that one
No
short.
magic pill for that one.
But what I teach our clients, let's again use what we're doing right now, the
Yeah.
work we do right now. I just wrote that blog on the website. By the way, you can get our blogs. You go to resolutionshealthcare.com and get blog. This one I haven't published yet, but kind of answers that. Sobriety is instant. Healing takes time. So I just did that group with our clients because where we go, resolving trauma has nothing to do with getting sober. People need to understand that. You go to an addiction treatment center and it doesn't have, let's say, even if it does have mental health services in conjunction with it, you are not resolving trauma in 30 days. You're not doing it in 60 or 90. That being said, severe trauma, like we talked about, takes time. So I don't want to drag it out, but I want people to understand sobriety. Before you can even begin to address it, you have to be sober.
Right.
You surely can't be intoxicated or drugged. And why are you using drugs and alcohol? We're noticing, and what I've said in previous podcasts, anecdotally, 80 to 90% of our clients have some form of an event in their past. The drugs and alcohol are not a symptom. It's an unhealthy way that they put out the fire of symptoms that come from unresolved trauma many times, and what we see. So I need you sober to even begin to connect the dots for you and send you off to say, okay, here's the way you have to connect the dots. You're sober now. You need to continue the work. And this is where everybody thinks 30 days, you're going to go home and everything is going to be fine. You're fixed.
Yeah.
Parents, loved ones send their loved ones to us. And 30 days, they might think their loved one's going to come back and everything's going to be fine. That's not the way it works. They're going to come back sober. And now the work begins. So we need to make sure, where does it take? If you asked me 15 years ago, my years working with children and adolescents, it took me anywhere from 8 months to 3 years to resolve trauma. And sometimes it was successful, sometimes it isn't. Now, that being said, that's severe trauma. There's all levels of trauma, and the DSM, that's our diagnostical and statistical manual, finally recognizes all these levels of trauma. Meaning you're somewhat healthy and a hurricane hits and you're caught in a hurricane, your house, and you're terrified throughout the night and you lose some of your property, your property and everything, and you're traumatized.
Right.
Counselors come in. That's why they call them crisis counselors. They come in and work with you, and a couple of hours of processing, you might be able to work through it. That's the quick version of something that may happen to a somewhat healthy person, and they get immediate counseling, and they kind of work through it. Versus people who have a traumatic event, it's unresolved, and now months, years, decades. You see it with our clients. Some clients, it happened 30 years ago. Well, that's 30 years of layers of habits. Right. Bad habits is the way to look at it. Bad habits. You're thinking, you're spinning. That takes time to unravel it, a little bit at a time. So again, the work has to continue. Now, do you need to officially go for therapy? I'm not going to say you have to have therapy, but you do have to educate yourself, learn more about what's happening to you. spiritually, however you want to self-educate, you need to do the work to be able to get to resolution.
Right. So there's no cookie cutter answer.
No,
Takes time.
it's right.
Takes time. You
Right.
can't rush it. G, did we miss anything? You got anything to add?
Nope, I think that's 3 more shows right there that we can dive into each one of those topics. So y'all let us know what y'all want to hear, and we'll keep on doing this.
All right, well, that's it for this episode of Start the Conversation. And again, we're doing these episodes, we're having these conversations just to help you out and get a little bit more knowledge, get a little bit more education in these areas where maybe you're struggling, or one of your loved ones or your kids or your spouse, somebody in your circle is struggling. Like Vinny said today, if you live on this rock long enough, you're gonna run into a traumatic event. And it's just based on where you are, your headspace, how you're gonna handle that, if you're gonna handle it right then, if it's gonna take a little bit. But we're all affected by trauma, so uh, thank you, boss, for spreading some knowledge and wisdom today. And we'll catch y'all guys next time.